He wasn't there.
Okay, I think the hush coming over the room is my cue to get us started. It's a little bit like a Taylor Swift concert or something. I think it's registering on the seismic register of the School of Humanities. Well, I am delighted and honored to welcome Professor Fred Moten. By the way, I'm Tyrus Miller. I'm Dean of the School of Humanities. And I'm delighted, as I said, to welcome Professor Fred Moten to UCI to deliver the 2023-24 Wellek Family Lecture. Professor Moten has been widely read, celebrated, and debated in several areas of scholarship as a poet, theorist, a performance and art scholar, and a historian and critic of Black arts and aesthetics, among probably many other areas that I haven't mentioned. Professor Kyle Grady from the Department of English will be introducing him today and speaking a bit more about his work, so I'm going to confine my brief remarks to the Wellek Lecture occasion. And it's worth noting this as an occasion because it really has a very distinguished background in history at UCI as our annual signature event in critical theory. The Wellek Lectures have taken place nearly every year since 1981, back in the previous millennium, and they represent path-breaking directions in critical theory. Annually, we host a series of 3 lectures by a critical theorist that relate to current directions and debates in critical theory. They're named in honor of René Wellek, a renowned comparative literature scholar who immigrated with the background of what was going on in the 1930s in Europe, from Czechoslovakia first to London and then to the United States. He was really one of the founding figures of comparative literature in the United States, primarily at Yale University. I didn't know he taught at University of Iowa before that, if you can imagine René Wellek in Iowa City. He authored a myriad of works, including the well-known Theory of Literature with Austin Warren, and an 8-volume history of literary criticism. His library of works of critical theory is now housed in Langston Library Special Collections at the University of California, Irvine, where we have a number of both papers and other sorts of artifacts of various sorts of critical theory at UCI. And we'll have a recession after the lecture today where there's a small selection of those that you can take a look at. Over the years, the Wellek lectures have included Harry Anderson, Frank Kermode, Jacques Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, Louis Morin, Jean Baudrillard, Beatrice Spivak, Homi Bhabha, Paul Gilroy, Angela Davis, David Harvey, Frederick Jameson, Etienne Balibar, Helene Sixou, Judith Butler, Edward Said, Achille Mbembe, Donna Haraway, Wendy Brown, Mahmoud Mamdani, and last year Ray Chow. That's not the full list, it's just a really spectacular sample of the list of speakers that we've had in this lecture series. And for those who are interested, the Critical Theory website includes the full list and further information related to the past lectures. I should also mention that these lectures have been the basis of an extensive set of book publications by the Columbia University Press. The Wellek lectures have been generative not only of ongoing discussion and debate in critical theory at UCI, but also literally internationally through the book publications that have come out of the annual lectures. I think it's safe to say that my first encounter with UC Irvine was through the Wellek lecture book series. That was as a student back in the previous millennium, decades before I had any idea that I might be a faculty member or a dean here. I'll also say that a look at the history of the speakers in the Wellek lecture series gives an index of the evolution of critical theory at UCI and beyond. The early years bear a strong stamp of literary criticism and French deconstructive philosophy, with speakers such as Jacques Derrida, Harold Bloom, and J. Gillis Mellor, with a strong tilt towards comparative literature, as the naming after René Wellek might also suggest. The 90s and the 2000s brought greater diversity both of approaches and disciplines, and with a more global perspective, including lectures representing feminist and gender studies, post-colonial studies, art historical and visual culture, and science studies approaches. Our most recent Wellek lectures have continued to represent the shifts and diversification of critical theory, encompassing new environmental, technology studies, memory studies approaches, and more. We honor our distinguished critical theory past, but critical theory at UCI is a living and evolving space of discussion and argument, helping us to frame new problems, uncover new bodies of evidence, and atom-rate new modalities of application and practical intervention in the world. It is in that spirit and in that context I warmly welcome Professor Moten as our 2023-24 Wellek lecturer. And I don't want to get involved in an infinite regress of introductions, but I will say a word about Professor Kyle Grady, who is going to make the full introduction to Professor Moten. He's an assistant professor of English. He's recently a recipient of the Institute for Citizens and Scholars Career Enhancement Fellowship in 2022. His work engages early modern literature and culture from a Black studies perspective, focusing primarily on Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, including the works of Shakespeare. And his work has appeared in several distinguished journals, including Shakespeare Quarterly, Shakespeare Studies, Early Modern Culture, and New Literary History. His book project tracks the development of dominant approaches to Black and white mixedness in early modern English literature and culture. So thank you, Kyle, for introducing, and please come up.
Thanks, Iris. Hi, everyone. I want to start by thanking and acknowledging the work of Amanda Swain and the rest of the Humanities Center staff for all their work supporting the Wellek lectures. Just a round of applause. I also want to acknowledge the work of the faculty, the Critical Theory Advisory Committee for their planning, as well as our Dean of Humanities, Tyrus Miller, whose office funds these lectures, so thank you. It's a real honor to introduce our speaker for this year's Wellek Lecture Series, although he in many ways needs no introduction. Dr. Fred Moten is Professor of Comparative Literature and Professor of Performance Studies at New York University. His incredibly influential and innovative work in fields such as critical theory, aesthetics, Black studies, visual culture, literary studies, music, and poetics continue to bring into focus conceptual spaces that accommodate Black art and cultural expression, eschewing those modes of analysis grounded in Western philosophical traditions that fail to speak to the Black experience. I first encountered the work of Professor Moten as a graduate student when I was introduced to the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, co-written by Stefano Harney, a text that brought into stark relief the disjuncture many of us feel between the institution and the modes of inquiry that draw their insight from the world. I would later discover Moten's remarkable trilogy of books, Black and Blur, Stolen Life, and The Universal Machine, collected under the title Consent Not to Be a Single Being, which powerfully demonstrate how Blackness, Black art, and Black inquiry are modes that resist the schematic and the formulaic, modes that profoundly exceed the confines so often placed on them. Professor Moten has also published numerous and award-winning books of poetry, including Houston's Tavern, B. Jenkins, The Little Edges, The Service Porch, All That Beauty, and The Field Trio, which won the LA Times Book Prize for Poetry and was a finalist for the National Book Award. It goes without saying that Professor Moten's areas of focus are incredibly and impressively wide-ranging. And in fact, the last time I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Moten speak, it was earlier this year at the Race Before Race conference on poetics, where he and fellow poet Jericho Brown discussed their engagement with pre-modern literature as part of a dialogue with medievalists and early modernists. Professor Moten's work has been the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism, the Stephen E. Henderson Award for Outstanding Achievement in Poetry from the African American Literature and Culture Society, and a MacArthur Fellowship. I know I speak for everyone in saying how excited and how grateful we all are to have Professor Moten here with us this week at UCI. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fred Moten.
Thank you so much, Professor Brady, Dean Miller, and all my friends and colleagues who are here today. I really am honored to be here. Already had a good time talking with students this afternoon, and so I'm feeling very, very happy and appreciative. I wanted also to thank Amanda, and to thank Suji, and other folks who've, made my being here so easy and smooth. It's just been nothing but a pleasure. I used to teach here, and during the time that I was here, I was lucky enough to have an opportunity to introduce Angela Davis when she delivered one of her Wellek lectures. Nowhere near as gracefully and as generously as you just did, Professor Brady, so thank you again. I guess I wanted to say a couple other things too. I find myself getting in this mode where the preface gets to whatever it is I'm supposed to do just gets longer and longer. Pretty soon, the preface will eclipse whatever it was supposed to introduce, but maybe not today. But I wanted to, obviously Renee Wellek is a renowned name and a renowned figure in the history of the development of literary criticism and literary theory. I believe Wellek was a student of Edmund Husserl. I think he was very interested in trying to establish for literary criticism some of the modes of scientific rigor that Husserl wanted to bring to philosophy. And I think that it was important, it's very important for me, it means a little something to me on a personal level to give these lectures just because I was introduced to his work by a wonderful person who was my dissertation director named Julian Boyd, who actually was a dissertation student of Austin Warren, who is the co-author of Theory of Literature. And I think that Julian would find it really funny that I'm standing up here. So I hope he's enjoying it wherever he is. I also wanted to say that maybe I need to give a little sense of kind of what my general attitude is these days, or at least over the last few months. I might have something maybe on Thursday or Wednesday rather to say about my attitude with regard to these more recent days, but probably over the last year or so, I've begun to think that, like we were just talking, Professor Cooks and I shouldn't tell on you, but we were mentioning, the prospect of retirement, and I have a date. Okay, so I'm ready, and I think that there's a moment in which one begins to kind of to think a little bit more retrospectively about things. Not in the sense of trying to wrap anything up or even trying to explain, but rather, you come more and more to grips with this sort of fact, that just as Foucault said, you've just been writing the same book over and over again. And it becomes so much more immediate, and in a way, I think part of what I would like to try to do over the next 3 days is specifically kind of think through some things that maybe I didn't quite think through as well as I might have in a previous book called The Universal Machine. And I won't say that much more about that because I address it in the talk. But this thing where you're sort of looking backward while moving forward is the mode that I kind of feel pretty committed to at this point. And so one can't help but think, critically, or at least it would, hopefully one can't help but think critically about what one has done, before. And so that's kind of the attitude that I sort of bring to the place, today. Still trying to figure something out. Okay. And what it also means, though, is that the mode of that thinking comes into a little bit sharper relief. And so I find myself harboring this, I don't know if it's a delusion. It's probably is, but I hope it's not. But I'm kind of feeling like what I would like to be able to say, what I hope will turn out to have been true, is that these are the last 3 lectures that I'll ever do. Because there's just something, it feels almost unsupportable, about standing in front of a bunch of people by yourself, reading something as if it were finished, when you know that it's not. And the worst part of it is the by yourself part. So I gotta say that I crave, interruption. It helps me to figure out what's not clear. And it doesn't even mean that I'll be able sufficiently to clarify, but at least it'll give me another chance. So if I say something that just seems completely ridiculously unclear, or just wrong or crazy, don't wait till the Q&A. Just give me a chance to get at it when I'm fresh, you know what I'm saying? So if you wait till then, it might be too late. It's helpful. It's not, I don't think of it as a bad thing, or, and it won't stop me. It'll help me. And what it'll really help me to do, you see, is to properly kind of calibrate the repetition. Because it's going to be repetitive. And the repetition is in part a function of attempting to address maybe a certain lack of clarity. And then there's another way in which the repetition is a kind of reveling, you see, in the lack of clarity. And I want to feel good about reveling in it. But the only way I can feel good about reveling in it is to have you make me say it again. Right? So I didn't know I was going to say that. The Isley brothers. Okay, so this, the last thing I'll say before I begin is, this kind of happened last time I was, well, not the last time I was here, but one of the last times I was here years ago to give 3 lectures. And it was really one piece. And so I'm not exactly sure if these things stand alone. I'll try to give some indication of what's going to happen next, what's going to happen tomorrow. I would like for them to have been able to stand alone in a way that, would make it so that if you can't come to all 3, you don't get penalized in some way. But I don't think I'm been able quite to do that. So.
I'm going to interrupt you right away
Okay.
and turn up the mic volume so everyone in the back can you say something.
Something.
Is that better in the back?
Okay.
Say a sentence. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Something comes from something. Speak again.
Okay, that's as high as it goes. So he has a gentle voice. And if it suddenly sounds too loud, let me know and I'll sneak up and put it back down a little bit.
So, well, that's a good way to start because I don't really want to say something. I kind of want to say nothing as emphatically as possible. And a lot of this, hopefully that little bit of cryptography will get some kind of cryptological, relief in a little while. But as I was going to say, there's sort of three parts to this. And I hope I can make this part as self-contained as possible. The general theme is Black performance violence, and performance is spelled P-R-E-F-O-R-M-A-N-C-E, and I'll try to say something about why that is. So this has three parts, and the first part is 0, and the reason I'm starting at 0 is because I have another preface to give when I get finished with this, and that preface is meant to kind of help set the tone for all three of the lectures. And there's a middle section of this first part that sort of veers off into a certain set of formulations about art and Black art. And then there's a third section that's sort of really the heart of part 1. And it's when I attempt to say a little something about Levinas. But I will tell you that I'm not necessarily finished saying something about Levinas. It's just that Levinas introduces a way of thinking about reading that I want to be sort of a kind of guideline for what then happens on tomorrow and Wednesday. 0. I'm shying away from the lecture with some combination of antipathy Actually, this makes me think, the last time I was here and gave a lecture, I played music. And I thought, I was trying to, well, anyway, I played this song. I played this great version of an old standard show tune called Just Friends. It was by, Coleman Hawkins and Sonny Rollins. And I thought about playing some music this time too, but then I kind of thought better of it. But all that feedback makes me think maybe I should have played some music. And so I won't play it, but I'll tell you what I would have played. I would have played this great live version of Willie Nelson singing Angel Flying Too Close to the Ground. And maybe that'll come up too. I'm shying away from the lecture with some combination of antipathy and inability. To say that you can't finish anything is also to say that you can't stop singing. What happens is a kind of sustenance that can be taken for ascension, a decay that can be mistaken for disappearance. Fallenness in flying, in grounding, is what it really hopes it is. It kind of wants to be analectural or anti-philosophical, veer away from dialects and dialogues, dialectical capture. which philosophy becomes when it comes to itself, or comes into its own, like when Socrates resolves to turn Gorgias's nothings into something. Okay, now I have to interrupt myself, since y'all probably ain't gonna do it. I just gave a talk like Friday, yeah, at this kind of really weird, cool kind of place called St. John's College in New Mexico. Anybody know this one? They're really heavy duty into, the classics and the Western camp, like in this, that's all they read, it's Plato, and Aristotle, and Thucydides. And so it was kind of a cool experience to give a talk to a bunch of undergraduates who probably knew more about what I was talking about than I did. And I was giving a talk on well, it was called The Gorgias Nothings. And I realized that I was probably, well, according to the people who say they know, mispronouncing Gorgias, who's a sophist who Socrates was in the middle of a certain pitched battle with over the distinctions between, rhetoric, mere rhetoric, and real philosophy. And there's a text that Gorgias reportedly wrote. It's very difficult, it's lost, and every once in a while certain folks try to take pains to try to reconstruct it, but it's called On Nature or the Non-Existent. And so this sense of nothing or the non-existent, that is not, if you will, is an interesting topic to me. And it just happens to be the case that there's this really, really beautiful collection of what most Dickinson critics call the scraps of her literature that was collected by a sort of curator / critic named, I think, Jan Bervin, called The Gorgias Nothings. So, see, I'm totally susceptible to being led by sonic accidents. And a lot of what I'm getting ready to say is sort of connected to that. One of them you'll see with regard to this term performance. The other you'll see with regard to a term that starts to come up pretty soon called the anthological, and I'll tell a little story about that. But in the back of my mind I'm still basking in the glow of this great visit to Santa Fe, New Mexico. So I'm thinking about Gorgias here too. And of course, the Analects is obviously an extraordinary collection of philosophical sayings of Confucius. Now, the question is there a relationship between philosophy and what we might refer to as merely philosophical sayings? Right? That's one of the questions that y'all will have to decide. It doesn't matter to me if you think that what I'm doing is not philosophical. It only matters to me that you know that if I'm not being philosophical, at least I know that I'm not, and that I don't want to be, even though sometimes it might accidentally seem like I am. The analectural wants to keep trying to make nothing out of something after all. So, hopefully, without any will to narrate, I want to tell y'all some stories that beg to be interrupted. Misleadingly, I promised Ray Tarada to offer a reading of Hannah Arendt, Frantz Fanon, and Emmanuel Levinas on violence. What I have for you, hopefully, violently, lovingly, preforms rereading Hannah Arendt, Frantz Fanon, and Emmanuel Levinas on violence. Preforms bears a little unbearably all but unearable dialectal buzz. I have to read that again. Okay, see, I'm telling myself to say preforms just so y'all will know that that's what I'm saying. Because every once in a while, I'll say performs, and it's meant to be P-E-R. It's just that when I say preforms, it really is supposed to be pronounced performs. But and I'll try to say something about what that means. So you have to bear with this next sentence. Performs. See, how can I say it right? Perform. Can you hear that? Can you just hear that little bit of push? Like, have y'all ever noticed how y'all like, this is a stupid question, but y'all like Aretha Franklin, right? You know how I think Aretha Franklin's S's very, very often turn to the SH. I think it's because her voice was so powerful, right? That kind of pressure, right, that you would need to, when tongue is pressed upon the glottis, she would unleash a kind of wind that made it difficult for that for the tongue to stay up there. And so that SH would happen, right? But that could be wrong. I'm appealing, I'm imagining, I want to almost say that, like what George Lewis says about AACM, that even sometimes Aretha was sort of, infused with a power that was stronger than herself. But I'm also interested in the way that those sounds, those what I want to call roughnesses of sound are really, really powerful and intense and deep, and I also think significant, let's say, in Black culture, I think pretty much on a kind of global scale. So that's why I'm belaboring this point. I want you to hear that when I say the P in point is not quite the same as the P in this perform, right? I don't want to overdo it, but I just want you to hear this thing, okay? And so this is how I would perform bears a little unbearably all but unearable dialectal buzz. And I wrote unearable, and it's a typo, but I kept it. Because it could be unbearable and it could be unhearable. Like some all but withdrawn diphthonic B plus H, always on the way to R, but ain't gonna get there. Always holding, finishing, and never comes to pass. Pre's deferral of per is improv's ongoing, oncoming retro projection. Looking backward and moving forward is criticism. But damn, I said that tomorrow. One way to think of it is, how did I let certain brutalities in the work of Fanon and Arendt and Levinas get me off the track of violence in their work? These lectures, then, are the remains of one last book called The Universal Machine. The lens and the general question of attitude, through which some dispersed focus will have been achieved, are provided by Walter Benjamin's critique of violence, and a repronounced echo of Werner Hammacher's indispensable criticism of Benjamin's indispensable text in an essay called A Formative Strike. The lens itself comes most clearly out of focus when it's framed by W.E.B. Du Bois's anticipation in texts like John Brown, accompaniment in another text, Dark Water, and overdubbing in Black Reconstruction in America of Benjamin's text from and within the apposition of a kind of quantum sociology that he offers in 1905 in a ridiculously amazing text called Sociology Hesitant. As far as I'm concerned, 1905 is in general the year of miracles. So I'll stop for a second. What do I mean by that? First of all, I don't know why I don't know, maybe I'm nervous. Like, I just want to make sure that is anybody here young enough to remember or old enough, I mean, to say, to remember, like, when P-Funk albums would actually come out? Like One Nation Under a Groove? Even later George Clinton albums like Computer Game. The guy who did the album cover work for Clinton was, and for P-Funk was this guy named Pedro Bell. He had a kind of studio that he called Splank Works. And it was amazing to read, to get the album covers. It took you like a year just to look at them, because there's so much weird little detail. And I always wanted to have a chance to fill stuff up with detail like that. So, y'all ever read Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar? Remember that scene because the saxophone player is playing a solo and he says, damn, I played that tomorrow. That formulation is something like what I'm trying to get to in this notion of an ongoing, oncoming retro projection. This thing again, where you're moving forward, but you're looking back. Moving forward while you're looking backward. One way to describe that is criticism. The other way to describe that is improvisation. I used to freak out. Improvisation is like to move, as it were, with a lack of foresight. Well, the reason that there's no foresight is improvisation is because you're looking back. Because improvisation is criticism. Miles, right? Played So What? 300 times a year between 1959 and 1968. And the version that he played in Chicago of the Plug Nickel in 1967 was a criticism, not necessarily a critique. It was criticism of the version that he played, I don't know, some other club in 1961. Do you understand? Right. Let me keep working on this. Let me keep working on this for a while. So part of what I'm trying to suggest is that this problematic of looking backward while you're moving forward, let's call it, it's a problematic of an angle, and it's also, one might call it the angel's problematic, i.e. the angel of history's problematic, right? Blown into the future by a wind from paradise. Okay. I think it's also something like what one might call a quantum. So, in Sociology Hesitant, which is written in 1905, the reason why I say it's like another moment in a year of miracles is because there's a couple of other writers who are doing some interesting stuff at that historical moment. I mean, many people, but the ones I have in mind, first is Rosa Luxemburg, okay, in her book on the mass strike. And the second is Einstein, who, if you'll recall, revolutionizes physics in 1905 with 4 famous papers, one on electromagnetism, one on the special theory of relativity. And that year is often called his annus mirabilis, right? His year of miracles. Or the 5th great paper, the year of miracles. The 5th great intellectual intervention into a sort of what one might call a critique of positivism. Okay. The 5th great paper is Du Bois's Sociology Hesitant. And anyway, okay. So I'm trying to read all these texts together. I'm trying to think about them together. This palimpsestic approach will require some consideration of angles and angels. We'll attempt to keep the deviance of topographical faith within these texts, reading closely and slowly in concerted digressions so we can see if the performative force of Black study makes precise descriptions of violence a bit more possible. Some questions about a proximity might emerge from the ruins of our intellectual credit economy. Some people speak of debt when they mean credit. Some people don't speak of credit when they mean kinship. The patriarchy that subtends this accounting overshadows the more complex matrices of study, wherein what it is that philosophy and its avatars and representatives, its methods and protocols, its subjects and objects owes to Black thinking, namely an incalculably way more and way less than theoretical mechanics of selflessness that will have also and of necessity obliterated the very idea of repair might come into relief. So I got these weird notes and diagrams here, and I'm trying to, again, sort of set a kind of, I don't know, right? I guess I almost want to feel like I'm trying to almost like give you a picture of a palette, you know? Something Robert Duncan talks about, you know, like there's these moments in Bending the Bow, one of Robert Duncan's early books of poems, in which he takes like a list of words and puts them in a kind of square-like grid, as if he's saying, these are the words I'm going to use, right, to make this poem. So, in a way that kind of would correspond to how we might look at a painter's palette before they actually start painting. So there's certain folks that are in play here. And for some reason, it seemed to me important that their dates be given, the dates of their birth. Sylvia Wynter, 1926. Hortense Spillers, 1942. Saidia Hartman, 1961. Denise Ferreira da Silva, 1963. And what I want to say is they anticipate Levinas, 1906. Arendt, 1906. Tran Duc Thao, 1917. And Fanon, 1925. In an incalculable rhythm Du Bois describes in 1905. And that activity, this incalculable rhythm to which he refers, he's referring to it as a kind of, as something unavailable to a certain kind of positivist sociology that concerns itself primarily with what he calls the evident rhythm of life, which for him manifests itself most clearly in relation to the birth rate and the death rate. He opposes, if you will, that evident rhythm with what he calls the incalculable rhythm of human action, which he associates with the activity of a woman's club. So we're working with the woman's club for the next 3 days, right? And I mentioned the women, you know, it's a cool club. Okay, but there's also these other 2 texts that I need to mention so that I can tell this other story that I need to tell. And it's partly going to help to finish the story of the performance. And it's also partly going to help to set the terms and conditions for this other part of the story that's given in the term anthological. So let's see, how should I go? So when I was in college, the only actual good thing about Cambridge, Massachusetts is this bookstore called the Glory Bookshop. Everything else was bad. And it's a bookshop that's strictly devoted to poetry. It's like you could fit 100 Groliers in this room. It's a little place. But it was a cool place. And it was a kind of haven, you know, if you hated everything else. And I used to go there all the time. And I remember going in there one day and seeing this book that seemed strange because it was bigger than most poetry books. And it had like a green cover. And when I picked it up, I was even more intrigued because it was heavy, right? Like it was substantial. It you know, you could feel it if you were carrying it around. And part of it was because the paper was so thick. And part of the reason the paper was so thick is because it was glossy, because most of the book were images, right? And what I mean to suggest is that they weren't printed. It wasn't a text that had been printed on paper. It was images of text that had been, you understand what I'm trying to say? It was when you read the text, you were seeing an image. You had to look at it before you read it. And not only that, you had to feel it before you read it. You kind of felt it before you looked at it because of its weight and because of its heaviness. And the book was called The Making of the Prey. It was a translation by this great translator named Lee Fonstein. It was University of Missouri Press. Okay? And it was a translation of a book by the great French poet Francis Ponge called, excuse my horrible French, I think La Fabrique du Pré.
La Fabrique du Pré.
Thank you. Okay, and see, thank you. I need help, right? I need friends. I'm like Richard II at Pomfret Castle, you know, and it doesn't bother me to need friends. It freaked him out, but I'm okay with it. So if I read through prayer, it's like, so help me more. Feel free, please, if you will. Pray. The pray. It can be translated as meta, right? In most of the translations of the poem is called the meadow. It's a book about the making of a poem called The Meadow. It's important that it's very specifically about the making of the prayer. It's not the writing of the prayer. In that respect, I immediately was drawn to that title because it was an echo of this thing that I used to listen to William Carlos Williams on tapes say at the only other decent place to be in Cambridge, which is this place called the Poetry Room in Lamont Library, where they had all these tapes of poets reading poems. And Williams would say, he said, a poem is not written, it's made. And obviously, he's invested in drawing to our attention the more literal translation of poiesis as making. Okay? So this book, I was like, I just got to get this book. I didn't know who this guy was. I never heard of Francis poems. I got the book on feel. Right? I bought the book on weight. Okay? I didn't read French any better then than I do now. Okay? But it has been like my constant companion for 40 years, this book. And one way to think about it is that it is a kind of ode to unfinishedness, an ode to previousness, okay? An ode to the eternally prefatory, which is something that we might associate with a meadow or with spring. And that sense of it being an ode to previousness is something that makes the book for me a preview to the work of another poet who's been also my constant companion in my head and sometimes in real life for almost 40 years, Nathaniel Mackey, who at a certain moment in a great book called The Bedouin Horn Book talks about something that he calls the sexual cut. And the way he refers to that, the way he defines it, the way the character, at least in this epistolary novel, defines it is an insistent previousness evading each and every natal occasion. I remember I went to a conference, the first conference I went to after I got my first job in Miami of Ohio in 1993. And I asked him, man, did you actually mean that? He kind of looked at me like I was stupid, you know, and said, yeah. And that's, right? What is it? What is the impact? What is the importance of this general sense of previousness? And it's in this relay between Ponge and Mackey that I guess I've always been situating myself, right? With you know, gradually, it's unclear how much success. Right? That relay, which is a kind of horizontal oscillation, right? I'm imagining also that there could be a way in which you could turn your attitude, change your attitude so that it becomes something like vertical too. But this sense of the prefatory, of the meadow, then shifts in this slight way to another book that I remember hearing about in graduate school and somehow finally found a copy of long after my dissertation director, Julian Boyd, told me about it. And it's a book, a translation, but I'll give the title in English, by great Swiss sort of linguist and philologist Jean Starobinski, called Words Upon Words. So it's that image of words upon words, right? Which is palimpsestic. And what it makes me think of is the notion of a field. Okay? But as it were, the horizontal field of a meadow. And when you say grass, right? When you say grass, when you hear the word grass, what do you actually hear? Right? Is grass a singular term or a plural term? Or does it require, or does it leave us free of the requirement to make that choice? Leaves of grass kind of puts a certain amount of responsibility on our backs, right? It's just grass. It's like that old kind of joke that my wife used to tell our kids, because I guess her mother used to tell it to her. You say, the kids say, well, I need a haircut. Which one? You understand? What if it turns out that the word the grass, kind of like haircut, is a suspension of the imperative to make a metaphysical decision? So I think of the prey, grass, meadow, as just such a suspension. It's like a moment of deferral, okay? The deferral of the imposition of choice. Okay? It's a respite, it's a pause, it's a bit of a recess, right? It's a break even. And if you take advantage of that break, if you linger in it a while, as Allison teaches us to do, you might commit an action. And if you wait a little bit longer than that, you might even get involved in a practice. So, all right. But that the meadow's like this, right? One thinks of it longitudinally. But imagine a shift in attitude. So that all of a sudden, what seemed to be side by side is now layered. You've all done that thing with paper, right? Where you got a stack of it coming out of the copier and you go, or you're trying to put it in the fax machine so it'll go through, and what do you have to do? You have to aerate it, right? You have to help the differentiation out with your breath, right? You have to infuse a little soul into the paper so that it'll work right. And it produces that fan, right? You know what I'm talking about. So the palimpsest it's an airiness that can emerge. And I believe that this is part of what it is that Starobinsky is saying in words upon words. The words are not upon each other in a crushing kind of way. They're upon each other in a caressive, aerated kind of way. And what happens is that you begin to see that this differentiation between words is also a kind of differentiation within the word, and that differentiation within the word is sort of what happens when we begin to recognize the presence of something like what we might call a translational effect. Derrida famously echoing Heidegger says there is no unique word for being, for anything else. Every word that you choose is accompanied by the words that you don't, which is what gives us the glorious opportunity to constantly repeat ourselves, right? In the wake of the essential and fundamental and irreducible unclarity that occurs with having said this word as opposed to that one. So consider that to be something on the order of what we might call a translational field. The word is not the word, it's a translational field, okay, which we cognize, which we approach, right? Not only with our eyes, not only with, our minds, but also, as it were, with our hands. We approach the transitional field, the translational field is something like what we might call a translational field. This interplay between field and field is part of what I'm interested in trying to say something about. And it's got really important implications, some of which could even be conceived of as apocalyptic. Because this interplay between translational field and translational field, one of the words that I want to give it, one of the names that I would want to attach to it is violence. So I'm asking you to go along with me in the next couple of days as I try to offer a different understanding of the normal one that we have with regard to violence. And in order to do that, what I also have to do, and I'll try to begin to do that especially tomorrow, is to offer a distinction between violence and brutality. So there's something going on between the making of the prey and words upon words. And I'm still there. I'm never gonna get out of that. I'm still wallowing around there. And so what I'm asking you to do is come there with me for a while. And I promise, I don't think anything bad is gonna happen to you. So now I tell you the second story. I don't even know if this is the right time to tell it, but I better tell it because it's already 7. I don't change my, it's 4:59, okay. So I got this friend, right, who, she's like a really good friend, a great scholar and practitioner of theater. Her name is Marielle Pellicero. And she's from Marseille. And she came to NYU to be a visiting scholar the same year that I started working there again. So we just became good friends, you know. And I'm convinced that she really likes me, you know, because unlike a lot of French people I know, she's very indulgent with my pronunciation. And at first I thought maybe she's just generally indulgent, but I realized not. Because at one point I was teaching a class on opera and we were listening to this amazing version of Carmen conducted by Herbert von Karajan starring Leontine Price. And Leontine Price is, and Mario's like, that's not French. I don't know what language it is, but that's. So I was like, you really like me because I know I'm not speaking French when you talk either. You know? It got to the point where I would feel bad about the way I pronounced her name. I could see, you know, that I'm not saying it bothered her, but every once in a while she would betray a certain discomfort when I would call her name. And so I got to the point where I was like, I'm really gonna try, you know? So I was like, yeah, you know, I was that weird way in which French seems to be like this. It's actually cool, right? It's like you say something, and in about 82% of the way through saying it, you start taking it back. I would mess it up, you know, and I couldn't do it smoothly, so I would start taking it back about 70% of the way through, and then I would bump up against something, and so I'm like, oh yeah, you know. And she finally just said, it's okay, just Marielle is fine. So we, you know, we're friends, and one day we were in class, and she was talking about something, and she kept saying ontology. She kept saying ontology, but it didn't make sense in the sentence. And every time she would say ontology, I was like, what? What are you talking about? What? And finally I realized, in like one of the greatest moments of my life, at least over the last 5 or 6 years, she was saying anthology. She was saying anthology. Okay. So there's another part to this story which is maybe not quite so pleasant, but I sort of have to tell it. I was kind of secretly wishing that I would see my old friend with whom I have not been friendly for many years now, for too many years, named Chandler here. But he's not here, or at least I don't think he's here. But if y'all see him, you should tell him that I said hello and I asked him. Nam was the first person I ever heard use the word para-ontology. I didn't know, I had no idea. As far as I was concerned, he made it up. And when he said para-ontology, it immediately connected for me to this other use of the word para that I was in love with, namely the paraliterary, which came from like one of the great writers in the world still living, Samuel R. Delany, and his constant use of the term the paraliterary, specifically with regard to speculative fiction. And I knew from a long time ago, we were talking about this today in the Black Studies group, at the level of language, at the level of everyday language, at least in the places where I grew up, to be around the working class Black folks that I grew up with meant that even at the level of language, you were already constantly being taught at the level of usage that there was something a little bit occult about the relationship between Black people and what Black people do in the verb to be. You understand? Like, lots of people do stuff, and then every once in a while you run into a bunch of people who be doing stuff. Do you understand? This occult relation to the verb to be is part of where I'm going. And you see what I'm trying to get at, right? That this weird little phonic anomaly between ontology and ontology, or ontology and anthology, it perked me up, you see. It connected up to something that I had grown up with and that I had been thinking about for 25 years, okay? By way of Baraka, by way of Fanon, by way of certain readers of Fanon. Okay. So when I heard Nam say paraontology, like literally, one time we had, like I picked him up one time at the airport and we pulled up into my driveway on Hillcrest Avenue in Los Angeles. And we stayed in the car for 3 hours. Do y'all? Like we couldn't get out of the car. It was like when Niels Bohr picked up Einstein, okay, at the ship, at the dock, okay, in Copenhagen, and they started talking about physics and they rode past the Institute for Physics, right? And then got all the way to the end of the line, and they rode back all the way to the dock. Do you understand? I kind of want to say it was something like that. Okay. So, and I began to use this term because he used it. But I also knew pretty early on that the way I used it was deviant from the way he used it. And I always wanted to mark that. I would say there's this term, paraontology, that Nahum Chandler uses, and I know that what I'm saying is a little bit different than what he's saying. But I still wanted to give him credit for the term. And then our mutual friend, R.A. Judy, told me, well, it turns out, man, that this really problematic, some would even say evil German philosopher named Oscar Becker, who was Heidegger's colleague, and who was also Husserl's student, right? He coined the phrase paraontology, the word. Becker's interesting, right? The Being in Time was published in the 1927, I believe, or edition of the Yearbook for Phenomenological Research. Journals were different back then. They would just publish 500-page books. And the other thing that was published in that issue, right, was Becker's dissertation on mathematical reality. So Becker was maybe a little bit closer in some ways to Husserl's own training as a mathematician. The point I'm trying to get at is, okay, this is what I was trying to intimate before with regard to this question of, let's say, the patriarchy, right, that subtends, okay, a certain notion of intellectual relationships. What I'm trying to get at is why it is that maybe the question of debt or credit is not quite where it's at. It's more fucked up than that. It's one thing to owe somebody something. It's one thing to be indebted to somebody. It's another thing to find out that they're your cousin. You understand? Right. Again, I'll talk more about this on Wednesday. But the thing about it is that what I wanted to do, at a certain point, it became clear to me that NAM didn't particularly like the way I was using parent ontology, or even maybe the idea that maybe it had somehow become more associated with me than with him, even though I was always quoting him when I said it. And I could see why he would be pissed, because it's like, why do you keep saying it if you ain't gonna say what I'm actually saying, right? So I said, I gotta stop using it. And then, of course, you know, there's a scholar named Axel Carrera who decided that she was gonna do a little bit of forensic intellectual accounting, you know, to make sure that the world knew that, you know, that there was some debt that I owed, you know, that I didn't necessarily want to owe to Oscar Becker. And again, this problematic of intellectual accounting is something that we can get into as well. But the point is, when Marielle said ontological, even though what she was saying was anthological, it was as if I had become like Clarence Thomas. The loan had been forgiven. And I could drive around in my RV and say, fuck everybody. Sleep in whatever Walmart parking lot I wanted to sleep in, so to speak. So, I see now I gotta have a different plan. Because I just finished page 1. I was like, do I have enough? Do I have enough? So I always get this, you know, I guess I got enough. Okay. So I'm gonna see how much further I can. This is 8:10, right? So I'm gonna try to find a good place to stop in like 10 minutes. Is that okay? And we'll pick it up tomorrow. Sorry. I didn't get to this problem of the description / name of violence in the universal machine. Like it didn't show up for me. It didn't occur to me. Like that book emerged from me being mad at Hannah Arendt. She pissed me off. And Levinas too. Actually, I was mad at all of them. Okay. I was mad at Levinas because of a lot of racist shit he said in these late interviews, which y'all know about. I was mad at Hannah Arendt because of really racist shit she says all throughout, but especially in this book called On Violence. And I was mad at Fanon because I think that Fanon was always saying, why was I mad? That's different. That's more complicated. Because I didn't love the other two at that point, but I love Fanon. It's harder to figure out how come you're mad at somebody that you love. I think the reason why I was mad at him is the reason most people get mad at people who they love. It's because you don't think they really love you. That's why I was mad. Why did I think he didn't love me? There's certain just mean shit he would say sometimes. You know? Like in Wretched of the Earth, he talks about the obscure hiccup, the obscure growl, the obscure jazz hiccup of the poor misfortunate Negro. It's like, I think you think you're talking about Louis Armstrong, at which point, no. But who I think you also might be talking about, and you don't know it, is Miles Davis. At which other point, no. Do you understand? Okay. Like, what did it mean that you could find what you were looking for in a certain kind of way in the desert of Algeria, but you couldn't find it in Martinique? What's that about, you know? If you couldn't find it in Martinique, I bet you then you wouldn't have been able to find it in Arkansas. You see what I'm saying? So look, that, you know, I just wanted to ask him, you know, but of course, Black people die young, right? They're cut off, right, from a future that seemed to me to be deeply and powerfully emerging, right? A future sort of embeddedness in a kind of thought of the non-normative, right? That would move against the grain of a residual humanism and even a residual liberalism that manifests itself all throughout black skin, white mass. This other shit was going on in the Wretched of the Earth. And they cut him off. and you'll never convince me that they didn't kill her. Just like, people don't just die. People get killed. Black people don't, anyway, right? You know, my children will die of anti-Blackness. I already know that. You understand? Right? It's genocidal. My mom, they told me she died of heart failure. No, she died of anti-Blackness on her 66th birthday. Do y'all understand? Okay. So, something was cut off. A set of chances, right? And the question is, what modalities of reading might reactivate those chances? What modalities of deviant reading? I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep myself from saying something mean. And I'm gonna succeed. I just need to take some water. Y'all ever see this film called Shoes of the Fisherman? It's like my favorite movie. You gotta look it up. It's Anthony Quinn plays the Pope. A Russian Pope, you know, who 2 weeks before he was elected Pope was in a gulag in Siberia. It's like magic realism. Right before the Russian premier releases him, Russian premier played by Laurence Olivier. Because what did you learn in your confinement? He says, I learned that without some kind of loving, a man will wither like a grape on a dying vine. Right? How might we lovingly, carefully, violently read Fanon so that it doesn't wither on a grape like a dying vine? Okay. So, okay. It means attending to this thing that links them. See, my thing was like, I couldn't take the Wellek turn. I did not want to apply phenomenological method and research to literature, and especially to the reading and the thinking of Black literature and culture, right? That the mode with which phenomenology thinks itself finally to have resolved the interplay between subject and object could never apply. Right? It wasn't applicable to this thing, to this stuff that I was dealing with. The way that phenomenology is always held within a metaphysics that requires it to make a set of ontological choices, that wasn't gonna work for what I was interested in trying to think about, which was not in the first instance anti-Blackness, but was actually in the first instance Blackness. So, but I missed the discourse on violence because I was mad. You understand? And my way of reading Levinas and Arendt and Fanon emerged from a kind of brutality that wasn't sufficiently attuned to the difference between brutality and violence. And so I had to check myself. I had to try, at least, to do that. And so that's what these lectures are meant to do. Let me go back. Let me look again. Let me see how violence works in these three. So in some ways you could say, Derrida in 1962 had already begun to do this with regard to Levinas in a great essay called Violence and Metaphysics. You know, I wanted to try to do something similar and at the same time extend it also towards Levinas and also towards Arendt. So that's what I'm in the middle. That's what this is a preface to. And for me, that moment in which Marielle began to open up a space through mispronunciation, opened up a space in the translational field between ontology and anthology, displacing ontology with anthology. In the same way that I want to figure out how to displace performance with performance. That's the work that I'm trying to get to. That's what I'm trying to approach in these lectures. And just, I guess, in general, you know, in life. So, I don't know, I kind of feel like, I think probably I've gone on enough. And I'm at the top of page 2. And I'll pick up next time. And next time, what I'm gonna do is say a little more about Levinas and then try to connect it up with the rest. I'm gonna try to say something about this relay between seeing, naming, and describing. Okay. I'm interested in trying to see if I can say something about description, spelled D-E-S-C-R-Y. And I'm gonna try to see if I can connect this up with, again, to connect all this up with this sort of relay between the anthological and the prey. Right? But I'm happy to just hang out and answer lots of questions if you have any. And, but I think I'll maybe, is it okay? Is it better to, I think I should probably
So we have plenty of time for some questions. I will ask you to take the mic, this mic that I have in my hand, when you ask your question. And if you could also identify yourself. And Fred, I'm happy to, kind of moderate, but if you want to just take the questions yourself, I'm sure.
I'm just gonna get this chair.
All right.
Hi, Fred.
Hey, what's up?
Hey, thank you for your talk and all I've learned from you over the years. Intoxicating to listen to you. With your permission, I want to be a little bit incoherent and a little bit cryptic. First question has to do with, would you make a distinction between previousness and givenness? And which one of them has an authority to influence the history of the present? In being attentive to either one, either modality, passive or active. That's one. I'm pretty sure that's faster the hand. I got to take hand away. The second has to do with a palimpsest. I have a story here of street addresses in Chennai in India. I've written about that. This is maddening. You'll have an address that will say, Fred, where do you want to go? The address is old number 22, new number 42. Neither erases the co-present. There's no retour, no erasure, like a palimpsestic one on top of the other, insisting on a double recognition. So in that context, how do you pick a trace in a palimpsest? Gramsci's notion of comparing inventory. And in your reading, from the point of view of Black experience, do you think of a palimpsest as an archive or as an anti-archive? The last question is, I hear you kind of teetering between, on the one hand, in the context of the phonic, defamiliarizing the semantic. Okay? Would you say that there is no meaning, or meaning is not semantic?
Okay.
I'm done. Thank you again. It's always a pleasure to hear you and to feel you.
Okay. Do I need a mic, I guess?
Yeah.
See, this is what I mean when I say that it's so much better to be interrupted, because everybody would have been saved so much trouble if you just asked. Because I don't, well, okay, all right. So first, and this is how come I know it's time for me to retire, because I hate to be one of those kind of people who's like, I'm not saying that I said something already because you should know it, or I feel like people should just know it. I'm just saying it because I'm scared that maybe somebody does know it, And I'm embarrassed about saying the same shit that I said, you know, a long time ago when I probably should have had something better to say by now, okay? But like in the break, I was pretty interested in, you know, what I wanted to do was to go against the grain of a kind of semiotic order, you know, a law that had maybe already been laid down, you know, in certain ways by Saussure, but then got, you know, reinforced, you know, by his, you know, by his, by his secret police, namely Lacan, you know, which is like, I did not wanna, I could not bear, I could not believe in the necessity of the reduction of the phonic substance as a precursor to the development of a, let's say, a science or a universal science of language. The reduction of the phonic substance, or what J.L. Austin calls, you know, the reduction of mere accompaniments of the utterance. It was mere accompaniments of the utterance was all I was interested in. Okay. And what it required, it wasn't, I didn't necessarily feel like I wanted to have some full out assault on meaning, but what I wanted to do was to be able to say, and although maybe now I would be more comfortable with making such a full on assault, particularly in the light of a better understanding of the intensity of the relation between meaning and value and so on. But what I wouldn't want to say is that, but I was interested in content. So it wasn't like a pure formalism. I was interested in the distinction between meaning and content. Because I felt like if I'm listening to James Brown screaming, and like, for instance, at the end of Cold Sweat, and it's deep, right? Because he starts screaming at the end of the song, and then and you feel like, he's in some paroxysm, some ecstatic, like he's lost it, he's gone, you know? And then he says, hold it right there to the band. He's still giving directions to the band. So evidently he's still got some kind of rational capacity there. And then he just starts screaming again. At which point, then you think, well, he's saying something here about love. He's not particularly saying anything meaningful. Even in the lyrics, of course, I don't care about your faults. I just want to tell you about your do's and don'ts. That's a line. I'm like, any language poet would be happy to have written such a line, right? What's the Godfather doing in 1966? And the point would be that I think he's invested in what it is that the music, that words and music can convey at the level of content that can't be held within a kind of logic of meaning, right? So there's something going on there, is what I would say. And it's not meant at all to dispense with meaning. There's a field of linguistic activity in which meaning makes sense and it's useful in our study and understanding of it. But there's something else too. And I was interested in that something else. Okay. So that's the third question. The first question was, had to do with
Previousness and givenness.
okay. Okay, so look, man, I mean, I remember when I was here teaching, you know, and I used to hang out all the time with our mutual friend, Akira, you know, and I only met, you know, Derrida once or twice, you know, because he wouldn't, I was telling the students today, he wouldn't come to Berkeley during the week. He'd only come on Saturday, right? Because he was in this fight with Searle, you know, and so he wouldn't come during the week. But I remember, but I was very deeply influenced and still am by his work, and deeply influenced by these things that would happen in his work see, as much as I was interested in sound, I was also interested in certain things in Derrida's work that couldn't be sounded. The most famous of which, of course, is difference, right? There's no sonic difference that allows you. So, you know, obviously that's within a language, but across languages, this can happen too. And that's the attraction of the double ontology, so to speak, that I'm interested in. another version of this would be this other word that's like a big word for me, maybe more so in the poetry than in the critical stuff. And it's this, the word forgiven. It's just that it's got another E in it. And I sort of touch on it a little bit in the universal machine, because I'm interested in a kind of, in what is previous to the given, right? Something that is before the given, right? But not by way of some strict ontological determination, but rather a kind of logical disruption that says that, as it were, there will have always been something before that. And this forgiveness, right, which is to say, before the given as the determination of a thing, right, that can be given. That in that forgiveness, right, the condition of that forgiveness is nothingness. Or another way to put it would be, and this is what makes the pun really bad, okay, because then you get caught up in some shit that you don't want to get caught up in. Because people hear you say forgiven, and they think forgiven. And within the context of Black studies, it opens up a range of formulations that end up claiming that you're, soft on anti-Blackness, or you don't pay sufficient attention to Black suffering. I'm saying, no, I'm not talking about forgiving anybody or forgiving them or whatever. What I'm interested in is this thing that is before the given. And again, and that's something that, for me, one gets from Mackey. But it's also just part and parcel of a general critique of the idea of origin that folks our age were kind of raised up in, as in our studies. Right? And so the weird pun that kind of causes trouble is the relationship between this forgiveness and a certain notion of absolution. Okay? Where, because ab is a cool prefix, and it sort of means kind of like before, and it's, and what it, again, it doesn't, this forgiveness or this forgiveness, which, and you put another N in there, this forgiveness that I'm interested in is one that operates outside of what one might call an ethics of normative, metaphysically determined relation. And then the second part of the first question had to do with, what does this forgiveness have to do with being able to, I don't want to say the wrong word, but let's say with present practices or acting in the present. I mean, I would want to say practicing in the present, or even practicing the present. And I think that it absolutely has something to do with that. For me, it's not a mere abstraction, because at that point, then the question of our ethical and social formations have to operate outside of the normative metaphysical foundations of political action. Because the terms of order of those foundations have been disturbed in and by this forgiveness, right? And that's a Cedric Robinson formulation to me. And then the second one, I just totally forgot.
What are the palimpsests being?
Yeah. Well, see, that's cool too, right? Because here's the, because I'm not even trying to act like what I'm talking about ain't messy. It's a mess. It's a mess. It's disorderly, right? In that kind of R.A. Judy sense of the word, disorderly, right? And in the same way that I would imagine, and you can get annoyed you're just trying to get home from the airport, right? Or whatever, and it's that, because it is as if where you're trying to get to is neither here nor there. It is as if it is as if somehow you've been operating in a perfectly reasonable Euclidean / Newtonian world, and all of a sudden, on the way home, you've been thrust into a regime of non-locality. Okay, and yes, that can't help but be a pain in the ass. It radically, where do you go? How do you locate yourself? In a different kind of sense than he means it, it's sort of kind of like what Frank would say, you don't have a place and time in the universe. Okay? But what I guess I'm trying to suggest is that the present we need to practice is precisely made possible for us in that displacement. And displacement is another word that'll come up maybe tomorrow or Thursday. But it's a weird word, and it's spelled DIS space PLACE/MEANT. And it's Norbesi Philip on the one hand and Amiri Baraka on the other, right? And I'll try to say something more about that too. Because the question is, how do we, well, this is what I think. What I think is that Black people, other people, poor people in the world, they know something about how to live this displacement. And they understand that this displacement is something which can be brutally imposed by power, but it does not originate in that brutal imposition. So that the normative subject reaction would be to say, I want a place in time. And this activity in the present of which that I'm imagining would be, let me defer that choice. Let me defer that moment of saying that in order to be, I have to be like, at this basic Kantian level, right? In which the subject has to have a place in time. So that's what.
Thank you, Fred.
I wanted to ask you, well, I remember reading in, I think it was in Black Op, there was a part that always stuck with me, and it's been kind of the guiding principle for me a little bit, where you took a moment to describe, I don't know if it was in a footnote or in the text, but you were describing your decision to stick with a particular translation of Manon, even though you said it was a bad translation. And you said that there was power or utility or something to have in that bad translation. And it reminded me of what you're saying about deviance today. And I wanted to ask you about deviance because it reminds me of, it strikes a chord with a lot of different scholars that have also been guides for me as a Black scholar. Christina Sharp talking about undisciplining the work, the idea of play as it's been rearticulated and circulated in different forms of scholarship, and on stages and in different other ways that Black people create. And I guess my question is very broad, even if it sounds simple. But as a practice and also as a predisposition, sort of preempting that practice, how do you imagine maybe amplifying the deviance as a thing that we do and internalize as Black scholars who come to the work deviantly, almost by nature, but also, as an active, attentive, intentional disposition. I imagine this is a methodological question, but it's also, I think, a question about what we feel and how we think when we approach a text, a song, or each other in these spaces. So I don't know if you need to share trade secrets, I guess, about Black studies, but I always wanted to, ask you about that, because the fun and the play and the deviance and the undisciplinary disposition seem really crucial to just the act of Black study in general.
Oh yeah, man, thank you for the question. It's like, well, just Friday night, I was sort of talking about this because I realized that in thinking about Emily Dickinson and Gorgia State, because when I read like Black study or whatever. That's how to read. So everything I read is Black studies. Plato, I don't. So, so I was thinking about how there is this kind of almost spy-like thing going on, in Dickinson's work, the way It's an open obscurity, right? And one word to use wouldn't be trade secrets, but it would be trade craft. In that way that spies use that word, like the Jean Le Carré uses that term, or the fascists on MI5 or something, just, how to keep secrets out in the open, so to speak. And obviously, the way Hartman would put it, is, the right to obscurity must be respected. But really, on the other hand, it's not necessarily a matter of rights. What if it ends up having to do with the very anthological condition, not only of language, but the general anthological condition. And here's what I mean, So yeah, like, I don't know if it was Black Op or the case of blackness, but because, man, when I was in grad school, okay, so I was in the English department at Berkeley, and Comp Lit was in this building called Dwinell, kind of down the hill. And it was different, it was like going across, a frontier to go from one of these places to the other. And one way you knew you were in the wrong place is being in a Comp Lit class talking about Freud, and if somebody said instinct, it would pop off. It would be like a high school football, like Compton, like Crenshaw versus Dorsey or something, Drive, Treep, drive. It's not instinct, And I felt something similar was happening in Black studies around the distinction between the fact of Blackness and the lived experience of the Black. Experience, I'm like, okay, right? And it felt to me that, but then I was also having to deal with the fact that sometimes I just liked the Farrington better than the Phil Cox. Sometimes like a good example, Rancière, right? What is it? Excuse my horrible French, the partage de sens, right? Who translated it as distribution of the sensible? There's a big ass difference between sharing and distribution, right? Distribution already accedes to a metaphysical order that sharing does not necessarily, sharing hasn't made that choice yet. I mean, this is something I'll try to talk about next time. There's a great physicist at Princeton named John Wheeler who used to do these things called the delayed choice experiment. Like, he was trying to figure out a better way of understanding entanglement, a better way of understanding non-locality, a better way of understanding this double slit experiment. He was like saying, it's as if a particle waits to decide, right, which way to go. And then you say, it's even weirder than that. It's as if matter waits to decide if it's going to be a particle or a wave. And Louis de Broglie said, well, it turns out that the mode of existence of the particle is wave-like, It's like, it's as if somebody's saying you don't have to, it's as if nature is, as it were, saying you don't have to make that choice, okay? So what if it turns out that, yeah, I believe that it's necessary actively, as it were, to practice this deviance. But the deviance is gonna exist where you don't have a choice. See, the choice comes in the repression of deviance. The deviance, the difference comes first, okay? Regulation, we were talking about this morning with just something I heard Michael Hart say, and it opened my eyes up deep. He was talking about Deleuze and Foucault and the way that they were kind of reading Marx. And it's like, resistance is prior to power. Deviance is prior to regulation. Discipline in the workplace responds to worker insurgency, right? We make little kids sit down in class because they're getting up, moving around, right? And the impulse to suppress that kind of movement is regulatory, and it's bad, okay? So here's the great dilemma that Black studies and Black radical thought, one of the great dilemmas that it has always had to deal with, which is how do we come to name and describe what it is that we want? And how do we deal with the fact that the history of the name of what it is that we say that we want is a really bad history, right? You see what I'm trying to say? Like we know it's horrible and difficult and all but unlivable and unbearable not to have a place and time in the universe. But it is the desire for a place and time in the universe, not the reality of that delusion, but the desire to fulfill that delusion, which has caused us so much damn trouble. So how do we learn to describe what it is we want without acceding to that formulation and to the various metaphysical and ontological commitments that go with that formulation? So it's not a matter of figuring out how actively to practice deviance, as maybe it's more of a matter of figuring out something like how actively to accept and to claim, as it were, the deviance. And 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 Christina Sharp's a great example. It's like, we could talk about this on a real simple kind of historical level, and we live in this moment of the pseudo-valorization of whatever, what do you call it? Multidisciplinarity or anti-disciplinarity. But then it's like all the great people, even in the history of disciplinarity that we read and that we're supposed to valorize, they didn't have any discipline. What discipline did Shakespeare have? He did whatever he wanted to do. It's like my son. My son called me last night, mad. I said, why are you mad? I can't stand Victor Wembanyama. Can't stand it. I said, oh man. I said, well, why? You might as well get used to it. Because it's what? 6 games into the season, then we see what's gonna happen. And it's probably gonna happen by the end of the year. Right? He might end up being the best player in the world by March. We see it, okay? I said, get used to it, man. Get used to it. Yeah, but he said, yeah, but he can do whatever he want to do. He pulls up and shoots threes from deep. He's pissed off at the fact that he can do all that shit. He's mad at Victor Wembanyama like the way that the people were mad at Baby Suggs for cooking all that food. He's mad at the abundance, okay? But it's an abundance of differences, That's where have we ever seen a gathering of differences like this, right? You see what I'm trying to say? So that's how shit is, so to speak, with is and erasure, right? That's the condition, okay? You can either be mad at it or you can commit yourself ethically to the flourishing of it, okay? And so for me, that's what's cool about, it was great to read Sharp writing about the anagrammatical, because it's like, that's what made me go back and find my Starobinsky book. Because Starobinsky is writing a book about these unpublished lectures that Saussure was giving at the end of his life on anagrams. And that palimpsestic translational field, I think that's what they're both trying to talk about. And the point is, that's the condition. That's the anthological condition. Violence isn't something that happens isn't something that happens to some other thing that undermines or disrupts the integrity of that thing. Violence is the foregiven condition of differentiation. Brutality is the reduction of differentiation. It's just like Schrodinger says in that book, What is Life? It's the imposition of equilibrium. That was kind of but that's, so I don't know if it's a trade secret or a trade, it's just like, look, it's also annoyingly close to certain kinds of shit that Heidegger might say. which is, you know, a kind of occupational hazard. Right? Because, you know, Gelassenheit, release, you know, let beings be, you know, shit like, you know. But anyway, at least that's what I think. So again, you know, to deviantly echo, you know, Frank Wilderson, it's like, it has to do with the recalibration of our Black capacity to desire. Or like Spivak used to say, you know, education is the non-coercive rearrangement of desire. So how do you learn how to not want home? How do you learn how to not want? Well, this is what I'll talk about one of these 2 days. And it's a horrible thing to say. I don't like saying it. My mom would be mad at me. I understand how come everybody's mad at me, okay? Or why people might be, nobody gives a shit, but I understand why a couple people might be mad at me. How do you learn to not want freedom? Which is chained to slavery. So.
Hi, Fred. My question is an interruption to your discussion about forgiveness, which I find very interesting. So my questions are like, where does that forgiveness come from? Is it a social construction too? Is it collective, or is it individual, of the individual level? And is it open for everyone of the present to get access to or to be aware of, or does it belong to a specific group? Or I would say, is there a specific Black forgiveness, or is there a general forgiveness?
Well, I would say, you know, and I'm not trying to be cute, you know, but okay, this will seem horrible, and I apologize for saying it, but see, this is the trouble. Usually if you can make a simple sentence, nobody really wants that shit. It's too simple, right? It's too quick. It's too messy is better, you know, right? I think. Especially, well, anyway, I was gonna make a bad joke, but now I forget the simple sentence that I was gonna say. The specificity of Black forgiveness is general forgiveness. I mean, I would say that. And look, I mean, I guess I have always been very interested in these sort of forms of cosmic, you know, unfairness that accrue to certain people in the world. And I do think that, you know, for a very specific set of historical reasons that are not mysterious, and in a way that is specific but non-exclusive, and also I think non-exclusionary. Black people have been given, as it were, the completely unfair historical task of protecting, right? Certain kinds of thinking, certain practices of thinking. Precisely because those practices of thinking and those practices of life, and I'm very much channeling Judy here, those practices of thinking and those practices of life were at a certain point subject to epidermalization in Fanon's use of the word. I mean, the example I like to give, it might be I don't know, I haven't given it in a while, so I'm gonna give it now, but it might, I'll stop if it starts to seem bad to me, let's say. But you know how people say, well, all Black people can dance, right? And there's a kind of reaction, like Stefano will call it the subject reaction. Yeah. So you put yourself in this position where you say, that's not true. Not all Black people can dance. That's an anti-Black formulation. And you totally, perfectly understand why people would say that shit, right? But all Black people can dance. Okay. Why? Because everybody can fucking dance. Question: why would you give up? Why would you relinquish, right? The claim, your claim on the capacity to dance, right? Just to stop somebody from being anti-Black. And can you stop them? Right? The refutation of that claim has never stopped. About something. You understand what I'm trying to say? Yeah, okay. So my whole thing is like, what does it mean that over the course of time, this capacity to dance was epidermalized, was racialized? Who are these people, and to what were they committed when they decided to say that it will be better for us if we are known as the people who can't dance? Motherfucker, how much money do you want to make? How much of the earth do you want to conquer? That's bad, right? Why would you give dance up? What do you think you're giving up when you give up dance? What do you mean to denigrate when you give up dance? What do you mean to regulate when you give up dance? And if we organize our sense of what we are or should be in response to that formulation, it feels problematic to me. Okay? So I guess part of what I'm saying is that it's interesting how on a historical level, there are certain examples like this, where a universal capacity has been relegated to the zone of Blackness. Right? Why? In the interest of brutal regulation. And what it ends up producing for some Black thinkers is a double bind, or a double kind of operation in which you reject both the specificity of the claim and the generality and the implicit generality of the claim. Right? You say, no, it's not true that all Black people can dance, A. And then you say, B, and fuck, and it's horrible that Blackness will have been, constrained to bear, right, this universality. And I just want to, I understand the justifiable reaction that produces these positions, but just because these positions are justifiable doesn't mean that they're actually true. And my sense of it is that the justifiableness of these reactions does not actually speak to whether or not they're effective. Which is to say, it does not speak to the question of whether or not they are effective in the battle against anti-Blackness. So I guess the best way to put it is just, I feel like this problematic has to be rethought in a sort of general way.
Okay, we have one hand which I've acknowledged and another, no, sorry. We need these to be tersely formulated. And I'll go ahead and take your questions and that you can respond as well. Okay.
Thank you so much. This might be an unfair question because it's going to be too early and too late. I'm going to ask about finesse. So I have been wrestling with Universal Machine for a few years, and I stumbled upon your lecture as part of the T.S. Eliot something part. I wrote some kind of poetry lecture, And you were talking about in one of your prefaces, I think the preface to what you ended up doing, you talked about how you experienced both with Eliot's racism at the same time that you were coming to terms with what you needed in his poetic sound, I think. I'm probably misrepresenting that. And at that point, I went back to Universal Machine and I asked myself, I was particularly dealing with the section on Levinas, where you talk about kind of confronting his racism is a necessary first step to begin to think about the radically important insights in his work. And I realized that I wasn't convinced that you, at that point, that you saw radically important insights in Levinas's work in the same way that when I listened to you talk about Eliot, I felt convinced by that kind of double tension. So now I'm curious, now that you're about to talk about Levinas, were you yourself convinced at that moment, writing when you were mad, that there were radically important insights with which you needed to deal with all this other stuff before you could approach that?
Yeah.
Do you believe that now?
So while we're moving towards the back of the room, I want to remind people that we have a reception across the breezeway, and we also have the display of the critical theory materials. So I really invite everyone to join us, and we also have 2 more lectures coming up where there may be the opportunity to ask more questions. So you've got the last.
Thank you. It's a great talk and a very exciting book. I usually don't get very excited about things. So my question would be, you started the talk speaking about Socrates and sort of rhetorical opponent. And Socrates was murdered, right? Like executed, essentially, right? Insofar as he was judged to have been going against democracy. And in that way, he wasn't a very good writer, right? And so when you talk about Levinas and European men and unintended racism, you situate Levinas as saying essentially there's only the Greek and the Bible. And so, but you start your talk with the Greek. And I wanted you to maybe, is that a sort of meta sort of thing going on where you counterposed it to someone who was, I guess, arguing about non-being? So is that where the black should enter? Put differently, on the first page of the Universal Machine, the great quote of Levinas, yes, of course, so far I am still a philosopher, but it supplies us the expression of a dancing civilization. They weep differently. And this idea of a dancing civilization is something you just brought up. Is that where we're supposed to enter? And in regards to the epidermalization of, I guess, certain attributes, dancing being one of them, what about the epidermalization of other attributes like, food, safety, security, moral perfection? Is that where do we disavow that? How do we navigate that? I guess finally, insofar as Levinas, was studied under a very important Kantian scholar, and sort of was at the Davos debate between Heidegger and Cassirer. You gotta help me, my French, as you know. This debate between finite ontology and then this sort of ideal thing in itself. And after the debate, I guess Levinas was a part of this staging, this mock, this sort of redoing of what happened in the debate, which both Heidegger and the other guy attended. And Levinas, he played the role of Cassirer, who had a wig and powdered it white, and basically kept repeating, I'm a pacifist, I'm a pacifist. he was more on the Heidegger side at that point. It's argued. And I'm just going to finish. And 4 years later, Hitler came. Heidegger joined the party. Cassier, he had to leave. 40 years later, I guess when Levinas finally made it to America, he found Cassier's wife and wanted to apologize for mocking him that way. And I'm wondering, with your encounter with Levinas at the level of Greek, Socrates, at the level of dance, are you promoting a type of pacifism that you might regret? Not that you might regret, but are you promoting a pacifism that might play into the sixth great mass extinction called the Anthropocene?
Well, I don't know, I don't think I would ever characterize myself as a pacifist. So, and again, part of the reason why I want to make an argument for a different understanding of violence is precisely to be able to, refuse the necessary imposition of pacifism that is constantly visited upon oppressed peoples. Because in general, it is only oppressed peoples who have to declare their nonviolence beforehand. Right? And so, in fact, what I am interested in making a distinction between violence and war. But it's only insofar as it seems necessary to me, given the fact that what we are in is a state of war, and have long been in this state of war, which I tend to think of as a war, maybe in Ivan Illich's terms, a war against subsistence. And it's important to make a distinction between subsistence and existence, I think. So that's one thing I would say. I'm not trying to make any kind of argument for pacifism. I'm not trying to make an argument for the idea that we should begin with Plato either, or Socrates. It's just that where I was Friday, that's what they talk about. So I was happy to go there and talk about that with them. Okay. And the real question, and the reason I was, is because having to read Plato and Socrates in order to prepare for that talk let me further understand how embedded I was in talking as if I were Plato and Socrates, even though I didn't necessarily always know that I was. So, I think it's always important for all of us to see just how much Plato and Socrates is embedded in the grammar of the simplest shit we say, like hello, or how are you, or I am decolonial, for instance. There might be some platonic shit up in there, at which point one would need, to call the doo-doo chasers, as George Clinton would put it. With the implicit formulation being that one of the best ways to deal with doo-doo, right, with mental diarrhea is to dance. And obviously Levinas is interested in the refusal of a civilization that dances, specifically a civilization that dances when they mourn. He's specifically talking about funereal practices that freedom fighters in South Africa were engaged in, the ANC. But he could just as easily be talking about the funerary practices in New Orleans, the second line. And I guess my formulation is more like, at that point, it's like, I don't give a fuck what you say, Levinas. Like, I'm not interested in your good opinion, and what does he say? just so, and I remain a philosopher. Well, I'm not a philosopher. And I'm happy to kind of say, you know, I don't want to be a philosopher if that's what being a philosopher takes. I never called myself one. I never will call myself one. I don't necessarily get mad if people call me that, but I'm not that. I'm not interested in that. I'm not even a theorist. Okay. But at the same time, there's some stuff going on in Levinas that strikes me as extraordinarily important. And here I'm kind of shifting a little bit to your question. I had inklings about it, and I tried to touch on it in that chapter. And it really had to do with this notion of escape that Levinas begins to work through. It might have taken him 40 years to get around to apologizing to Cassira's widow. I never heard that story. But by 1935, he had already written an essay called The Philosophy of Hitlerism, which I do try to talk about in that chapter of the book. So he knew some shit was going on pretty early on. And I think he had made a kind of shift. Now, what's interesting is for us to consider what the limitations of that shift was. And what does it mean for this man who has lived through what he lived to say at the end of his life that the world is the Bible in the Greeks? That's a statement that I'm interested in, not only because it reveals some of his limitations, but also because what if it turns out that the shit is true? This would be a reason not just to call for the end of the world, it would be the reason to eliminate the concept of world. My sense of it is that the concept of world can probably be reduced to the Bible in the Greeks, which is how come I don't want any of it. Right? So even, you know, sometimes people say bad things, and you still have to read it because sometimes the bad things they say reveal something about the way that they think and the assumptions that are given in what they think and why it is that we can't think that way. Right? So I don't know. I don't have any big, you know, and this talk, again, I guess I tried to say at the beginning, nothing began here. It might seem like I began with the Greeks, but I didn't. I can tell you, I would like to be able to tell you where it began, you know, and if I did, you know, it might allow you to think a little bit more kindly of me. You know, I had to do today in the meeting, you know, I was asked, you know, to give a
kindly of you.
Oh yeah, no, I don't. No, I said more kindly. I don't think that you don't think kindly. I just want more. You know what I'm saying? But I would, you know, I would. So where did it begin? What was the intellectual biography? And I said, well, I was born, you know. But it didn't begin with that. Again, like Mackey says, there's an insistent previousness evading each and every natal occasion. There's no beginning. I don't know what the beginning would be. My tendency would be that rather than to try to offer a specific critique of this or that notion of the beginning, that it's probably better to go along with my training, at least in this regard, and to engage in a general critique of beginning, as well as a general critique of ends, right? So it's a preface to some shit that I can't finish, okay? But so that's part of it. There's a lot more to say. I mean, that's the thing is I really want to make a good argument for the Plato and for that thing, man. It's deep, it's interesting. Because yeah, the state did kill Socrates. And what's interesting is that Socrates in this particular dialogue called Gorgias is trying his best to make an argument for why it is that philosophy is superior to rhetoric, precisely because philosophy can lend itself to a more efficient and a more honorable use by the state. We don't ordinarily want to think of Socrates as a state philosopher, but in Gorgias, he's making that argument, right? And it's interesting to then think about it in relation to what we'll see in the Apology. you know, and all of that. You know, that's a, you know, shit, if, you know, I could see teaching a class on that shit. And the name of the class would be Black Studies, you know, Plato. And now, you know, what is there in Levinas? I believe that this notion of escape. See, I started working on that chapter in like 2006 or something, you know. And the stuff on like Kentridge at the end of it, that stuff goes back to like 97. I mean, 'cause I was just still working on it. But what I was trying to, I was interested in the notion of escape. And it struck me that it was important and even potentially deep and useful from that Levinas talks about a kind of escape from being, you know? But then part of what I end up doing in the argument, in the article is I'm wary of this notion and this desire of escape. And at that point, I feel like what I was already getting out of it was that it was forcing me to try to think better about this notion of fugitivity that I had picked up from Mackey and from Baraka and from, you know, every place throughout, you know, sort of Afro-diasporic, you know, literary tradition. But I was wary of it. And I was probably wary of it in a way that was kind of similar to the way that Nahum would have been wary of it. Because Nahum is like, you can't just opt out of ontology. And I think maybe that's at the heart of some of his impatience with me, and certainly some of his impatience with a certain set of thinkers that get yoked under the, maybe voluntarily, under the rubric of Afro-pessimism. And now what I would think now is two things. One, that I think it's really important that I wanted to, I was wary of the way he used escape, but I didn't want to dispense with the notion of escape. And it required me to realize, again, and it made me go back and read Nate Mackey more carefully, that first of all, fugitivity is, it implies escape or flight, but it also implies pursuit on the part both of the fugitive, so-called, and the one who is after him. And this pursuit is also interesting, especially if we begin to think of it in relation to this notion of the eternally prefatory, of the unfinished. Escape is not an achievement, it's a practice. My sense of it is that in some ways, Levinas seemed to believe that the way he was trying to think about ethics will have accomplished an actual escape from ontology. And I don't think that's the case. But what I also think is that that was a relatively early essay. And by the time, so that the stuff I kind of want to try to talk about tomorrow is Levinas, is the 9 Talmudic lectures and a kind of ethics of reading, a wild, kind of messy, violent ethics of reading that I think Levinas is invested in there, that I think corresponds in all these really cool ways with the poems and with Stravinsky, but which also corresponds in, I think, brilliant ways with a whole array of Black cultural practices that I've been interested in. So, and another way to put it would be that there's a way in which what Levinas is doing, especially in this essay called The Temptation of Temptation, that there's a way that what he's doing is creating this really, really interesting alignment between between Talmudic study and Black study. And I've been interested in thinking about this stuff also actually in all these kind of really generative ways with Ethan Kleinberg, with the Boyarin brothers, you know, and all these very cool, very friendly, very, really beautiful conversations that I've been able to have with them, and that my friend Jay Carter, who will be here soon, has been happening. So, so that's kind of what I wanted to try to talk about tomorrow, and then to just wrap it up. And what I was going to try to talk about Thursday gets back to these questions about the present, about the war against subsistence, and why it is that this interesting entanglement of Black study and Talmudic study manifests itself for me in like the most absolutely emphatic what's the word I'm saying? The most absolutely emphatic imperative, not just to be in solidarity with anti-colonial struggle, but to actually engage in anti-colonial struggle in relation to specific shit that's happening in the world right now. We'll see if I can get to all of that.
That seems like a very good point to interrupt with this unfinishing end. And I want to really also thank Ed Moten for this amazing lecture and conversation. We would like to cross the way to reception. Please join us, carry on the conversation.